Good afternoon, and welcome to the research paper presentations presented by Major League Baseball. My name is An Luong, and I'm on the Sloan Research Papers team. It's my pleasure to introduce Luke Bourne and Patrick Ward, who will be presenting the paper titled Training Schedule Confounds the Relationship Between Acute-Chronic Workload Ratio and Injury. The presentation will last 20 minutes, after which we will hold a Q&A session for 5 minutes. If you're interested in asking a question, just raise your hand during the Q&A session, and we'll provide you with a microphone. Now, please join me in welcoming Luke and Patrick.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming to the last talk of the day in the research paper talk about a fairly obscure topic. So I've been coming to Sloan for quite a few years now, and one of the first experiences that I had with a vendor here, they told me that they could cut our injury rates at the time I was at AS Roma by over 50%. And of course, my first inclination as healthy skepticism, I'm not sure I buy it, but there was some part of me that said, if this is real, this is a big deal, right? Cutting injuries by 50%, this is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It turns out that it was complete BS, and the company went belly up the next year. But at that point, I realized that this is a huge industry with dozens of companies, dozens of consultants, sort of, for lack of a better word, selling this snake oil of injury prevention. And in fact, it's not just companies and consultants telling teams that they can reduce injuries, but it's at the consumer level as well. So I'm a cyclist, and I sort of am all nerded out with all the data on my bike and everything, and in all the software that I use, Strava, Training Peaks, Trainer Road, Zwift, they all use the same things that we're going to talk about in a minute, where they're sort of monitoring what you've been doing and say, hey, you've been working a lot lately, you're more likely to get injured, or you haven't been working very much, you're less likely to get injured. So as time has gone on, just being exposed to this industry for so long and exposed to the world of injury detection and injury prevention, I've become more and more of a skeptic. But the truth is, I never really understood why what was being advertised, and in fact what the sports science literature was saying, didn't match with my experiences within different teams and different clubs. And thankfully, along the way, I met two amazing people who also had the same sort of healthy skepticism that I did, and that's Patrick Ward beside me here, who's a sports scientist, and Darcy Norman, who's an athletic trainer and a physical therapist. So the truth is that this project took a really unique combination of backgrounds. I'm a statistician. These guys it really required the three of us coming together to really understand this mechanism that is causing a lot of people to think that injuries are detectable, when in fact that's a very questionable claim. All right, so let me just set the tone for the talk here. So we're going to talk in particular about something called the acute-chronic workload ratio. This is the thing that I see when I go into Strava and I go into Zwift or Training Peaks. It turns out that it's not just like industry and software and sort of consultants selling this stuff. It turns out that it has a huge academic background. There's tons of papers in multiple reputable scientific journals saying that this acute-chronic workload ratio, which Patrick's going to describe, is meaningfully predictive of injuries. Okay, then I'm going to talk about confounding. If you don't know what confounding is this basic idea that if we look at data, let's say weekly data, comparing ice cream sales to drowning deaths, it turns out that ice cream sales are really predictive of drowning deaths, right? So don't eat ice cream because it increases your risk of drowning. Of course, there's a confounding effect there, which is it summer or not, right? So that's what essentially the basic idea of confounding. There's two things that are moving up and down together. You might think that one's causing another, but in fact there's a third thing, in this case summer, that's causing both of them, or the season to cause both. And then we'll talk about some of the solutions to address it. So let me pass it to Patrick.
Cool. Thanks, Luke. All right, so acute-chronic workload ratio. At the most fundamental level, for those that don't know, this is just a metric that was created to assist practitioners with understanding the training load imposed on athletes during training over time, over a season. Quite simply, it takes your acute load, represented as the most previous 7 days of training, divides it by the chronic load, represented as the previous 28 days of training. And I'm being very vague here with the term load. Perhaps some of my physiology colleagues would hate me for that. But I'm doing so because this has been applied to multiple different metrics, multiple different types of internal and external loads, everything from subjective ratings of perceived exertion and heart rate to GPS and velocity measures to accelerometer, inertial sensors, even most simply to a paper from 2 years ago using something like minutes played in NBA games. Within the scientific literature, evaluating this metric, what's been proposed is this sort of U-shaped relationship between injury and acute chronic workload ratio, whereby if you have a very high acute chronic workload ratio, you're at risk of injury. If you have a very low acute chronic workload ratio, you're at risk of injury. So, for example, if you train too much, if you overtrain, you expose yourself to risk. If you undertrain, you expose yourself to risk when you're eventually put into the game and you have to perform at a very high level that your body's not prepared to do. Within that U-shaped relationship, it's been described that there is this training load sweet spot somewhere between 0.8 and 1.3, whereby athletes are at a lower risk of injury. Some of the positives that I think have come out of this before we sort of get into what we looked at are that it is easy to calculate. Any practitioner can do this in Excel. It's super simple. You don't have to have a coding background or anything like that. It is intuitive for coaches and practitioners to understand. And then most importantly, probably, it gets coaches thinking about historic training demands or historic training loads. So coaches, especially during the season, tend to be very myopic and worry about what the player did yesterday and what they're doing today and what they're going to do tomorrow in preparation for the game, and forget that there's this potential residual effect of things that we've done leading up to the most recent sessions. So a bit of the history within this metric to let you kind of understand where it came from. It's no surprise that this metric is found in a lot of the cycling apps and web pages that Luke uses. In the first paper published on this evaluation of acute chronic workload and injury risk in cricket bowlers, they actually discussed that they modeled this sort of concept off of a guy named Andrew Coggin, a physiologist who ran the website Training Peaks, and at the time it was called Training Stress Balance. And that was actually borrowed from 1975 research from a former Olympic runner, Bannister, who then became a physiologist and a doctor, and he went on to build these models that would basically explain performance, particularly in swimmers, and how residuals of training led to gold medal wins. So the first paper was in 2014, evaluating this relationship, and then 2015, let's see, I don't want to hit it twice, should I try? Oh, there we go. In 2015, an editorial piece was written by Blanche and Gabbett in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and this is probably the most frequently referenced editorial piece on the topic of acute chronic workload ratio. It's the one where the figure on the previous slide came from, of the U-shaped curve, and talks about the sweet spot. 2016, the first group of researchers followed up their work, this time looking at this relationship in rugby. Since then, since that 2014 paper, there's been hundreds of papers evaluating this relationship. That 2014 paper has been cited over 250 times, the Blanche and Gabbett editorial piece over 150 times. So it has been very prevalent, and people have gotten a lot of interest in what this relationship is and what it means to potentially save money or affect performance. Of course, not all the research has been positive. There have been a lot of questions about this type of this metric and some of the issues with it. For example, some authors have proposed the potential of identifying a new acute chronic workload ratio using something like an exponentially weighted moving average that can account for decaying effects of fatigue that occurred from sessions performed way in the past. Others have talked about something like a spurious correlation between the numerator and denominator of this metric caused by mathematical coupling, whereby the numerator is contained within the denominator. And they've proposed this concept of something like an uncoupled version of the metric, whereby you're looking at the most recent 7 days relative to the 28 days prior to those 7 days, so not including those 7 days. People have built models using this metric and then tried to test those models on out-of-sample data. It hasn't been found to be very sensitive to really predict anything. Others have talked about, is this even worth the effort, given that there are times of the season where we won't be collecting any data. If you're with a team, you're not collecting data, for example, on players during off-season. So it's sort of this black hole of what's going on in European soccer. They go away on international break. You don't really know what they've been doing. So it's kind of when we look at all these issues, it's like, where does that leave us, or where do we go from here? And we've done some work on injury and acute chronic injury and workload training. And this acute chronic workload metric frequently comes up in our discussions. We kind of talk about, like, what do we do with this? How do we think about it? And one of the things that we've often talked about, or the hunches that we've had, is this really just an artifact of the training schedule? For example, we know from the literature and we know from practice that there's times of the year where training is highest. For example, the training camp period, where coaches purposefully increase training demands in order to get the players ready for the season. We also know from the literature and the science and the practice that those are also the highest periods of risk and injury. So with that, I'll turn it over to Luke so he can talk about how we unpack this.
Thanks, Patrick. So let me talk to you about how all these papers, so these all papers across numerous sports, these really academic, legitimate scientific papers have studied this problem in the past. So what they've done is they will take, regardless of the sport, they'll take a season or 2 seasons or 5 seasons of data and look essentially for every player in every training session and say, let's calculate this acute-chronic workload ratio leading into the session. So let's do the ratio of the last 7 days to the ratio of the last 28 days, sorry, the ratio of the 7 days to 28 days, and then look at that number and then see in that session, did that player get injured or not? And look over the past couple seasons and just say, is there a relationship here? And it turns out that like remarkably strongly, uniformly across sports, there's a significant relationship. It turns out that acute chronic workload ratios are highly correlated with injury. And in terms of thinking about causal pathway, it makes sense to think, hey, this acute chronic workload ratio is literally measured right before the session. It's like the previous 7 days. And so it makes sense to think these things are highly correlated. One happens before the other to assume causality, right? But our argument here, and as we're sort of continually alluding to here, is that there's a missing piece. This directed acyclic graph on the left here, which says, hey, acute chronic workload ratio is causing injury. There's actually something else. It's not that acute chronic workload ratio goes up or goes into the sort of danger zone and injury goes up. It's that there's a third thing, schedule, that's causing both of those things to go up and down together. And so the basic idea there is that if I've trained really hard the last 7 days, so let's say I'm an athlete and I've worked really hard the last 7 days, it turns out that if I've worked hard the last 7 days, it's more likely that I'm going to be working hard today, right? So in other words, if I've worked really hard the last 7 days, right, that means my acute chronic workload ratio is really high, and therefore it also likely means that the upcoming session is really high, which in turn increases my injury risk. So in other words, the directed acyclic graph sort of explaining the causality here is perhaps better explained with what's on the right. So how did we tackle this problem with some real data? So here we looked in 2 different sports. So we looked in American football, a team in the NFL, and we looked in Italian soccer, a team in Serie A. And so what you see here, each of these dots is the load in one session. So on the top you have American football, on the bottom you have Italian soccer. And you see each dot here, on the like these little dots along the bottom, those are off days. So those are 0 load days, right? And then all the dots above sort of running across that's the session load in that particular session, so that training session. And what I've plotted here in red is the acute load, that's just the 7-day average. And the blue curve is the chronic load, that's the 28-day average. So you can think the way all of these studies work is they look at a particular session, they take the ratio between the red line and the blue line, and they say, is that predictive of whether an injury happened or not in that session? Okay, that's what all of these studies are doing. So it turns out that we've looked at this on our own, in this data and others, and we've confirmed this, right? Every time we do this, acute chronic workload ratio is highly predictive of injury in a particular session. It's true. It's absolutely true. So what did we do to sort of address this? We think, hey, there's something weird going on here. We don't really know what it is, but it's something. And so we essentially undertook a big simulation study. And what we did is we assumed what I'm going to call a null model. And that null model is that acute chronic workload ratio is irrelevant to predicting injury. In other words, everything leading into a session does not matter for actually saying whether injury happened in that session. So what we do is we simulate these seasons. We do it in both the NFL and in Serie A 1,000 times. And we simulate the data, or simulate the seasons, injuries in those seasons, in such a way that the only thing that affects your injury risk in a particular session is the intensity of that session. So to be clear, we're simulating seasons. At each session, we simulate whether an injury happened or not, and the probability of an injury happening, all that matters is the load in that session. Anything previous, like acute chronic workload ratio, is irrelevant. There's no impact in terms of simulating injury. So we've simulated in this a way to be clear that there should be no relationship between acute chronic workload ratio and injury. So we do this, we run these 1,000 seasons of simulation, and here's our results. Here's are the p-values for the results. It turns out that we do this, and we do what's called a chi-square test to sort of compare whether or not acute chronic workload ratio is compared to injury, and it turns out to be extremely highly significant. Okay, if this doesn't shock you, it should, right? We simulated very specifically so that acute chronic workload ratio is unrelated to injury. Right? We designed this in a way that it should be zero correlation. But when we actually look back post hoc over these 1,000 seasons we've simulated, it's extremely highly correlated. Right? Okay, maybe this is just statistical significance, not practical significance. No, it turns out that when you do this, the post hoc analysis of these 1,000 sort of null model simulations tell us that the increase in injury risk in Serie A is 6.8%, and in NFL it's 10.5%, which is a pretty big boost, and is about of the same order of what you see in the literature across sports in terms of the effect of acute chronic workload ratios in terms of injury probabilities. So, where are we left with here, right? We've done this simulation. It says we've used real data from the NFL and from Serie A, and we've sort of said, hey, let's just pretend that acute chronic workload ratio is irrelevant and sort of see what would happen. And it turns out that you recover the same sort of levels of significance and injury predictability as the literature has shown. So what's causing this? Here's the basic underlying idea, and again, I've said it already, but let me say it again. Here, this plot here is showing American football on the left, Italian soccer on the right. What you see here is the density of the session loads, okay, for across the season. And on the red line here is those ones where you're in like the safe zone, or the sweet spot, it was called in that U-shaped curve. So again, the red is the distribution of session loads when you're sort of in the sweet spot for acute chronic workload ratios. And the blue one is the curve, or the density of session loads for when you're in that danger zone, okay? And so the very simple observation here is that when your acute chronic workload ratio is really high, it's more likely that the upcoming session is hard, right? It's what I already said. If my last 7 days are hard, so my acute chronic workload ratio is high, it's more likely that my next session is also going to be hard. And of course, it's not necessarily causing injury, it's just predictive of the next session, and the intensity of that session is what's causing the injury. All right? So this gets back to what Patrick was saying before, right? That it's the unique characteristics of training schedules. You have training camps where someone's coming out from doing zero work to all of a sudden doing a lot of work, and the acute chronic workload ratio spikes, but they're also extremely intense sessions. You have international breaks. You have sort of the natural sort of weekly cycle of this. And so what's actually the solution here? So it turns out that the solution, or at least one possible solution to address this, is all these studies and all these analyses need to look at the actual session info for that particular session. To be clear, there's a reason they haven't in the past, right? If they look at a particular session and a player gets injured, that data is censored, it's thrown out, right? If a player gets injured in the middle of the field in an NFL practice, they're not like, oh, let's carefully extract the GPS unit and make sure we capture the data, right? That's the last thing they're worried about. That data gets thrown out and disappears. So you really need to understand the session load within that particular session. And so what you need to do is instead of just looking at the relationship between acute chronic workload ratio and injury, you also need to account for what the session load was in that particular session. There's a couple different ways to get into that. I don't want to talk about the details that are in the paper, but you could use survival models, which sort of look at when they were injured and how intense it was until the moment they were injured. There's also opportunities with latent variable models where you could show, you could use information about training loads for other players, maybe in that same session who weren't injured. And so as a final conclusion, I sort of mentioned before that in our studies, we had seen the same thing that all this literature had, that acute chronic workload ratio and all the data that we have across sports, acute chronic workload ratio is predictive of injury. But when we apply these models, and we account for session info in that particular session, that the significance of acute chronic workload ratio goes away. So in all of our cases, it goes from being highly significant to being non-significant, okay? So what have we done here? Have we disproved this whole industry? No, right? We haven't said that all of these papers are wrong, but what we've said is that the way that all of these analyses are done, that has sort of spawned this whole industry, has led, or the way this is done is in such a way that it's really open to the significant confounding effect. So it doesn't prove them wrong, it just says, hey, the causal pathway that this relationship that people have found, there's another really good explanation for it. And that's that this training schedule is sort of causing sort of a statistical artifact for us to see this relationship between acute chronic workload ratio and injury. And we will stop there. Thank you.
All right, we'll open up to questions. Anyone have any questions?
Hi, my question is, do you distinguish different types of injuries? Or to be more straightforward, how do you define your injury? Some players, they got injured, like John Wall just ruptured his Achilles at home, right? This is completely non-training related. Do you discard those people, the players, when you do the sample simulation?
So specifically, actually maybe this is a better one for you to answer.
Yeah. So the way that we would define injury would be a non-contact injury, so something that doesn't have to do with collision. I don't know what happened to John Wall, but we also can't disprove that rupturing his Achilles walking up his steps at home is not due to training and play. So I couldn't say that, but we do use, we only are talking about here non-contact injuries, so not things that happen just due to the ergonomics of the sport, collisions and things like that. So it would be a non-contact injury that, per like the UEFA definition, would be a non-contact injury that leads to a player missing either a subsequent session or match.
Thanks, Luke. Patrick, in terms of the sensitivity of the devices we currently have on the market, do you think if we're trying to capture session load on the given day of the injury, where do you think we're at in terms of the sensitivity of those devices to really quantify load? And is that a limiting factor in the modelling you've run or the metrics or variables you look at within those techs to really detect what's going on? And do you have any commentary on that?
My gut reaction is if you think of these units, or whether it's the sort of inertial sensor units or sort of GPS, optical tracking, if you think of those as just noisy observations of the actual load, then in some sense what you're doing in all of these cases is you're just adding noise to the covariates. And so in that sense, actually, you should be weakening the power of this study. So in some sense, it actually, the effects here should get worse, in some sense, the more accurate. So you wouldn't expect to sort of, you would expect, basically, as you sort of weaken the data and you make these sort of sensors worse and worse and worse, you would expect that this relationship should deteriorate. So the fact that we see it's already so strong, sort of across sports and different types of sensors, would make me sort of intuitively suspect that even as the data gets better, it's not going to make this problem disappear, and it might actually make it worse.
So from a decision-making perspective, if there are folks in this field that are selling snake oil, how do folks that don't want snake oil make better decisions with this type of data that you're looking at?
I think, I'm sure Patrick will have more to say, but there's a lot in the sports science world that's like very scientifically proven, right? It's like lots around nutrition, around strength and conditioning. There's still a lot of stuff that shows that certain behaviors, certain types of training positively and negatively impact performance. So there's still a lot of like really, really valid things that community is doing, just maybe this isn't one of them.
How about looking at different classes of data, like wellness data on a daily basis, physiological data, biomarker data. By looking at it from a multivariate perspective, you may come closer to defining injury risk.
Yeah, for sure. What we don't know here is whether all of this sort of strange statistical artifact is due to the fact that acute chronic workload is just too simple, right? It could be that if you account for more things, sort of more multivariate approach, as you say, that you actually can tease out a meaningful signal. And again, to be clear, this isn't saying that even acute chronic workload ratio is irrelevant for predicting injuries. All we're saying is that if you don't account for the session load in the particular session, that it can lead you to sort of artificially see that these things are more highly related. And that's essentially the approach that's been taken in the literature. So I would, I guess, support what you're saying, which is to say there could very well be more complex mechanisms such that we still can predict injury. So I'm not saying we're not saying that task is fruitless. We're saying that this approach has sort of had flaws in terms of the way it's done.
And from an applied perspective, sometimes you're limited by the things that you are able to collect. The injury and training relationship is a relationship between dose and response, and I don't think in team sport we have a great measure of response at the moment. Wellness questionnaires are a good idea, but I've never seen any good validation of how to make those actually work. I mean, most of the data I've looked at across 4 different sports of years of data is essentially a bunch of professional athletes putting the number 7 in every day. I can't tell you anything from that.
Okay, so just out of my curiosity, but how accurately can you predict the current workload just from the previous 7 days workload?
It's a good question, and we've talked about this a little bit, because of course, if you can do that, you can treat it sort of as an unmeasured confounder, and that's another way that you can adjust for this in those studies. The problem is that approaches like that, where you're sort of accounting for the session workload, require like a fair bit of statistical chops, and the issue is that a lot of this original literature was sort of brought up by people whose background potentially is not very statistical. So absolutely, if you can predict the session workload coming up, you can account for it in these studies, and you can get a much more realistic quantification of the relationship between these things.
One more question.
Thank you for the presentation. Because it's a ratio, you can have obviously different denominators. So you can have a low chronic load and a high chronic load and different numerators and still get the same ratio. When you looked at the injuries, did you find any difference between the effects of high or low chronic load? Because there's a thought that the high chronic loads provide a protection for an acute jumping load.
Yeah, I guess my answer to that was that in some sense here, in other studies we've looked at injury, but this is really specifically about like this ratio, which is sort of the number one thing to look at. I will say that you get the same results if you just look at acute load. You see more or less the same thing, that it comes down to this fact that the last 7 days are super predictive of the next day. In terms of our chronic loads actually protective, this study definitely does not address that.
We also did try this with 2 different denominators, coupled and uncoupled, with the same results. So.
All right, I think we'll finish there. Thanks again.
Thank you.